Welcome everyone to the IGP's Soundbite for this week. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore and I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity, and I'm delighted to have you all joining us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kieron Stanley, who is the current head of Science Monitoring and Evaluation for the Environmental Land Management Scheme at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as an honorary research associate at the University of Oxford. Dr. Stanley has an academic background in social psychology and in the cultural geography of the environment, food and rural affairs, and has research experience in West Africa and Europe. After he had completed his thesis, he led an action research program on environmental inequalities across the UK, co-funded by the Environment Agency and Defra. And he has experience in different roles across government, having previously worked in the Cabinet Office as well as with the French government in Strasbourg. He's worked also as a special advisor at the WHO and has represented the UK at the OECD and at the European Council. And within DEFRA, he's had a variety of roles over the years, and he was part of the Natural Environment White Paper team. And he's going to speak to us today on environmental land management and the landscape recovery scheme. So Kieron, welcome to the IGP. We're thrilled to have you with us. And why don't we get right into it? And I'll just offer you the floor, please.
Thanks very much, Henrietta, and great pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to really cover a few points this afternoon. First, I'll do a little bit of an intro. I'll provide a tiny bit of detail about what on earth environmental land management is, and then I'm going to focus on landscape recovery, which is one of the three schemes under environmental land management. And then I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the sort of science, social science, and other elements of research that go on in the background to help us design these schemes, monitor and evaluate them, and take the lessons from them to design future schemes and adapt things as we go along. So if I just go into the next slide then. So environmental land management. There's quite a bit of detail on the slide there, but essentially environmental land management is the sort of cornerstone of our agricultural transition away from the European Union's payments to farmers that we were part of for many years. If you like, it's something of an environmental turn, trying to dedicate public money for public goods. And you can see there a whole list of key environmental outcomes that we're looking to prioritize, everything from clean and plentiful water down to beauty, heritage, and engagement with the environment. There are three schemes. So one is called the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and this is primarily for farmers, and it will pay them for actions that they take to manage their land in an environmentally sustainable way. Then we have another scheme called Local Nature Recovery, and this will pay for actions that support local nature recovery and deliver local environmental priorities. So that's something of a collaborative effort. And then the third scheme, the one we're going to focus on today, which is called Landscape Recovery, and this will support the delivery of landscape and recovery through long-term land use change projects, including projects to restore wilder landscapes in places where that is appropriate. So large-scale tree planting, peatland restoration, water restoration, and these projects can deliver a wide variety of environmental outcomes and support local environmental priorities while making an important contribution to national targets. So I mentioned national targets. All of this, of course, is trying to do as much as we can to deliver against our 25-year environment plan, as well as all of our commitments nationally and internationally, for example, to net zero. So I'll move us along. I promise you that the pictures I've got here, they start dull, but they get much more exciting. So hopefully there'll be more color to come. So this is just a quick overview of how those three schemes sit together. So as I say, Sustainable Farming Incentive kind of does what it says on the tin. Local Nature Recovery is a bit more of a collaborative experience, and then Landscape Recovery is the hugely more ambitious proposal-led scheme that I lead the analysis for. So you'll see there on the on the slide, it's a scheme for landowners and managers who want to take a more radical and large-scale approach to producing environmental outcomes. It's an entirely new approach, and it's very much focused on the long term. So these schemes are likely to include contracts that would run for 20 years plus. And these are sort of key outcomes, not just for those who are taking part, but as part of our national footprint of what we're trying to do for our environment and people. So, that sort of suggests that there's a huge amount of potential with significant positive impact. Some of the basics though, so these schemes will be, these projects within this scheme, we're going to pilot this year. So we opened the scheme in February the 1st. People have 16 weeks to apply. They then get enrolled. They then, if successful, can have up to 2 years of development funding, which helps them shape the sort of environmental outcomes they're looking to deliver. So there are all kinds of complexities within that. So for example, how do you generate carbon sequestration? How do you measure it? How do you perfect it? How do you optimize what you're doing there? Different types of tree species on different types of soil have very different potential outcomes, and all of that has to be looked at against the backdrop of environmental change and climate change in particular. So as you can see here, this is just a slide that talks through some of the aims in a little bit more detail. As I say, we're looking to have 10 long-term projects by 2024. So we'll be trying to pick those this year. So that'll happen in June, July of this year. Then they will have up to 2 years of development funding. So they'll start their implementation in 2024. And one of the primary goals of this piloting phase is to learn what we can about how this all works, whether it works at all, in fact, and ways to improve both the processes and to try to sharpen those environmental impacts and outcomes we want to see, as well as the social and economic footprint of these projects. So the first round of these projects is going to focus on 2 themes. One is recovering and restoring England's threatened native species, and the second is restoring England's streams and rivers and improving water quality. So from those 2 priorities, you then should have a whole bunch of other environmental co-benefits that are satisfied. So for example, improvements of habitats, improvements of upstream and downstream issues like flood mitigation and so on, that should come from focusing on those 2 key themes. Eligibility. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with hectares versus acres versus square feet, meters, and so on. But a minimum of 500 hectares is our eligibility requirement, rising up to 5,000 hectares. So those are huge plots of land. We're looking for projects that are contiguous. So, we're talking about single land parcels that might be made up of a number of different participants collaborating over that space. But ultimately, we're very much looking at landscape as defined by those sorts of sizes of land. All land is eligible, including parcels of land that are already involved with all kinds of other schemes. I mean, it just makes sense to try and do what we can, where we can, with as many people who want to participate as possible. And then we also want public bodies, where they're interested to collaborate with other land managers. So for example, we won't have the national parks absorbing all of this funding in isolation. They'll need to work with other people. And obviously there are lots of benefits to all of that. A little bit more on the selection process, as I say, opened on the 1st of February. There are then 16 weeks for people to get their proposals together. They put those into us, we evaluate them. That takes about 6 weeks as well. There's lots of legal and technical evaluation that needs to take place. They then go through some enrollment with our delivery bodies. They then have potentially development funding of up to 24 months, and then hopefully they'll be in the implementation phase after that for a good many years. So that development phase is quite key. As I say, we really want to help people get the best outcomes they can, and that requires them collaborating effectively, but it also requires them building the technical capacity to deliver high ambition environmental goals, as well as take people with them. Local communities, both nationally as well as locally to the projects, need to really feel fully entitled to engage and participate and feel the rewards of these projects. So a little bit about some of the science and analysis that's in the back and foreground of this work. So projects are selected based on criteria. Those criteria are fairly technical, and they require us to assess the stipulations of environmental outcomes that people suggest that they will achieve. Now, this is proposal-led. That means that people put a proposal into us where they state what they think they can achieve, how they think they can do it, who's going to participate, over what kind of timescales, and so on they think these environmental goals that we're looking to fund can be achieved. So we need to evaluate that quite closely. And obviously, not all of these things are beyond controversy scientifically. So some are also technically hugely demanding. So we expect, people in my team, I'm the head of science monitoring and evaluation. So I have people who spend a lot of time looking at how we might monitor projects, how projects might monitor themselves, how we might integrate that kind of information, how we make use of interested parties, citizen scientists, and so on to also help us build a high quality, high caliber picture of what's actually happening on the ground, and then how we can look to understand change over time and report that effectively, as well as share that data with scientists and others who are keen to carry on further research off the back of it. So a huge part of that is our work alongside one of our sister programs, which is the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment, which is in a nutshell, it's a national assessment of environmental condition across England. And it looks at all kinds of stuff. So here's a picture sort of suggesting the sorts of areas it's looking at. Habitat networks, peat and heat mapping. Then you have lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, groundwater, and NCA also looks at marine environments as well. So a bit more detail on that. Comprehensive long-term program to transform landscape decision-making in England. So that's obviously key to environmental land management, but it's also pretty key to a whole bunch of other government bodies, both within the DEFRA family and beyond. It's a little bit more detail. So they do a strategic sample field survey. So that's obviously been quite tricky. So it's been very hard over the COVID period to get people standing in rivers and in fields in their wellies holding rulers or quadrants or whatever it might be. And the technology that might otherwise replace those people or augment the sort of data that we'd collect that way is also quite difficult to deploy and maintain over the last couple of years. So we're looking at all kinds of innovative ways that we might collect that kind of data. Everything from audio recordings to Earth observation and so on. And then of course, there's a massive effort to integrate all of that data. There's lots of modeling work that goes on alongside it to see what more it can tell us. And obviously we're very keen that this data is shared, it's used by others, it's improved by others and contributed to by others, particularly what you might call citizens. And those citizens are, in the case of Elm, very likely to be farmers or other land managers, or they might be those taking part with environmental NGOs in local surveys, whatever it might be. All of that data is potentially hugely valuable. For us, the trick is how you make sure the data's quality assured, clean, integrated, and as available as possible to all potential users. So just to do that within the Elm specific area, there's an awful lot of short to medium term work that needs to happen. So there's habitat mapping, there are lots of digital products. We need to also look at things like botanical heat maps, trees outside woodland. Again, that's something that could be hard to identify unless you're looking at more innovative ways of recording. And then, of course, there's a whole suite of new technologies available: artificial intelligence, machine learning, and government, I have to tell you, is not particularly great at taking on board new technology, making best use of it. So, any help that the academic community or third sector, etc., can offer us to get better at that, get better at sharing data, get better at using data that exists elsewhere and integrating it into what we do, that would be my cri de coeur for today. It's very easy to berate government. It's, would be much more helpful to constructively partner with us and help us improve as well. Then as part of that, I think longer term, that better evidence point that's being made at the bottom there about a trusted evidence source accessible to all stakeholders, I think I'd see that as quite a plural platform for us all to get the benefit of. I think there aren't many researchers out there who don't think that a nationally accessible assessment of environmental condition wouldn't be useful to researchers across disciplines and across institutions. I think that would be hugely valuable to us all, and it'd be great if we could all work together to input to it and get best use from it. So a little bit more detail in this slide as well about how that relates, again, as I say, to what we do within environmental land management. So, a key problem we have is having the right things happen in the right places. So spatial prioritization. And for landscape recovery, that's particularly difficult because obviously we're reliant on people coming forward from whichever part of the country they're in to say that they do or don't want to do the following within a proposal. So we're very much reliant on people coming forward with their good ideas and then assessing it. So how that works spatially, obviously, is a bit of a challenge. And then longer term, there are all kinds of challenges. Modeling would be one. Assessing change, looking at baselines, counterfactuals, assessing where government's investment has worked, where government's investment hasn't worked, where things are happening and nobody knows, whether it's because of investment, whether it's a change of practice or whatnot. All requires excellent R&D, and I think again a lot relies on being innovative there. I don't just mean with technology. There's lots of social innovation and all kinds of things that we can bring to bear there as well. Again, I'd say that we don't do that very well at all. We do need help. We do need to build a broader partnership of actors who can potentially help make a step change there as to how we do those sorts of things. And then again, like I say, there's lots of new tech, Earth observation and so on that could potentially be fairly transformative, but I think that comes with a whole suite of potential other issues that social scientists and others have been very good at helping us to identify. So I'll stop there. It's probably a little bit briefer than I'm used to, but it's probably best not to read out slides that you have before you. So I'm very happy to take any questions though.
Thank you, Kieron, very much indeed. And there's some absolutely beautiful pictures in that. So they did, you were right, your slides did get considerably sexier as you went on, which was very, very, very good. I think there are lots of people on the call who have lots of expertise in this area, and we'll come on to them in a second, but just as setting off in the conversation, I think one of the things that many people who are not used to thinking about these issues might be interested in is this problem of how close do we think we are to really being able to get the UK to net zero by 2050, which is one of the big challenges, isn't it? I mean, and how do you, when you're given the job you do, what kinds of things help guide you as you're working with your team here? Because there's a lot of responsibility sitting on the environmental land management scheme, isn't there, in that goal, especially at the landscape level?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably at the heart of it, Henrietta. I mean, it's hugely challenging. We do feel the pressure. Environmental land management is one, but not the only means of delivering on net zero. There are a whole bunch of other things, and all of those need to come together. But we also need to have a common picture of what the priorities are, what the trade-offs are. And I think that's probably the most challenging thing, particularly across departments where, you know, obviously energy has a huge part to play, as does transport and so on. So how we prioritize our activity, how we sequence that across government as well is hugely challenging. And so for environmental land management, I think one of the challenges we have is being seen as you know, one of the only vehicles to doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And of course, land use change and land use practice takes an awful long time to deliver. And so I think it's not just space, but it's time that's very pressured here.
And I think it's very helpful for people listening to you to recognize what the scale of the challenge is, even for the UK, which is, after all, you know, a small island, or rather two small islands. So I mean, part of one other anyway. It's not at all easy to do. But in terms of things like you were talking about the science evaluation and people coming forward with proposals, how important do you think it is that for DEFRA itself to have sort of reached out to universities and perhaps built its own toolkit or its own set of gold standards for assessment? Because that's one of the issues too, isn't it? How to make sure that all of those schemes are going to bring in the right sets of comparable data, for example.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's another challenge. So you have a incredibly complex funding landscape for research in the UK. I don't know whether that compares favorably or not internationally. You'd all be much better placed to comment on that than I would. But we have our research councils going through something of a transition with the onset of UKRI and so on. We have Haldane principles, which ensure that we fund the best research first. So departments like mine that are always, you know, asking research councils to go more applied tend to get a little bit of challenge with that. And you know, there are pros and cons to that, but obviously as a recipient of research council funding many years ago, I can see it from both sides of the fence we have before us. All of that does tend to mean that you do have several offers. I mean, the same would be true in you know, the digital space and the artificial intelligence space, machine learning, and so on. There's lots of proponents of how those technologies should be applied. There are different schools of thought and practice on all of that. And quite often people look to government to be fair arbiters of a reasonable way forward. And, you know, we inevitably, given that responsibility, tend to be a little risk averse, a little cautious, which isn't always good, but sometimes it does have its merits as well. So I think the challenge for us is always to try and look to efficacy and efficiency in using, you know, these novel approaches. How to integrate them again is particularly challenging. And then, you know, particularly with the set of ministers we have at the moment, we're always keen to try and see what the sector solutions are, what the farming community, what the environmental sector are saying. You know, people who, you know, to be quite frank, quite often know much better than government how to do things, what they're proposing. And so where we see different approaches coming from the sector itself, I think we tend to take quite a keen interest there. How we work with research organizations and institutions. I mean, we talked about net zero earlier. We wouldn't be able to produce any of our modeling, any of our baseline work, any of our counterfactuals without the huge effort of the UK research community. And we work with, I think it's hundreds of different universities currently, and certainly across all of the disciplines as well. We're not good. I'm not sure that academia is much better at always being aware of what best and good practice is and where it's happening, and how to make use of it. So again, I would say it's massively challenging. And then I'd also say, please help.
Okay,
We're
well,
very,
we're
very
happy to do
open
that.
to people with good ideas to help show us the way forward. I think there are new endeavors as well. There's the UK Agriculture Partnership and various other things that are attempting to try and help synthesize different practices. But again, at the moment, I think there's it's quite a rich market out there to pick and choose from. And unfortunately, a lot of people always look to us to be the fair arbiters, and we're not always best placed to do that.
No, it's very difficult. And it's also I think it's important for people to understand that the new sort of policy making is about collaboration in a way. And of course, that is, you've talked a little bit about the collaboration with the universities and so on. But the other part of it is collaboration with ordinary citizens, isn't it? And there's a big landscape change here that's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I've touched on it a few times, but the important actors here are all of us, really. I mean, everyone has a vested interest in a decent quality environment, in dedicating public funding to the right places at the right time, prioritizing, understanding trade-offs. I think all of that is hugely important to a fully functioning democracy.
I'm coughing. I think this would be a good moment for Bob to come in. Bob, you have a question.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That was a really interesting presentation and very inspiring. I have several questions. One is, how much funding is there for these sorts of activities? That's a straightforward one. Second one is, who actually does the assessment for these projects? Is that something that you all do internally? Is that something that you will sort of reach out to the larger academic community to help do that? We've been involved in several projects, I think, that are relevant to doing just this kind of assessment of soil health, landscape quality. We can talk about those later, but how much, where is that assessment done for these projects? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And then the last thing is, you're talking about fairly large scale projects that are going to hopefully involve multiple landowners, private and public participants, citizens at various scales. Are you also interested in different kinds, more innovative kinds of institutional arrangements that could help manage these landscapes in a more collaborative way, things like common asset trusts or other things that would facilitate collaboration and cooperation among the many stakeholders on a complex landscape?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take the last one first because it's the easiest, Bob. Yes is the answer. We're looking for all kinds of innovative arrangements. Common asset trust would definitely be there. As I say, for landscape recovery particularly, it's proposal led, so people can pretty much put anything on the table that they think works for them, as long as it's hitting the right environmental goals and is reasonable value for money, and it's taking the community along with the project. I don't see any problem at all with whichever arrangement comes forward. And indeed, we're looking at all kinds of longer term legal or pseudo legal arrangements that might also help support people to sustain things longer term. How the assessment is done, there are 12 people on a panel. That's for this round. So part of the job of this round is to help us learn what we're doing right, what we're not doing right, and what ways we could go about doing things differently. So that panel currently consists of external expertise, some academics, some government officials. We also have to take legal advice. We also have to have economists and so on look over the numbers for us. That panel is published alongside all of the other details of how the assessment works. And I'll do a
So is there
conflict of interest disclosure here. I'm the co-chair of that panel.
is there some modeling facilities or tools that you use as part of that assessment already? Or are you still looking for additional sort of modeling and assessment tools to in the future going forward with those to help with those kinds of assessments?
Yeah, so I mean, we're probably looking at 10-ish projects this time round, and we're always looking for modeling, good modeling, modeling that can work alongside some of the models that we have. Again, its integration is one of the key factors, but we're certainly always up for sharing what we're up to and looking what others are doing and where there could be ways of working together. So yeah, please do come forward with that. On funding, the current public commitments are to £2.4 billion per annum for the life of this Parliament. And that's split across the 3 schemes.
Great.
So local nature recovery hasn't started yet. Sustainable farming incentive has, landscape recovery has. So
how much of that? How much of that would go to landscape recovery of those 3? Of that 2.
Well, while we're in the pilot phase, not a great deal, but they are designed to share that money equally over time.
Equally, okay.
Yep.
Excellent.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think I've stopped dying quietly on this side of the screen, helpfully. So let's move to a question from Shemuel Yerushalmi, who's asking you, how can environmental forms of land management be used for improving food security and adapting agriculture to climate changes?
A great question, a great challenge, or challenges, in fact. So obviously regenerative farming, more sustainable practices and so on should be more efficient. That's always been the win-win of the sort of productive imperative around resource efficiency for some. But obviously there's an ecocentric imperative there as well, where we want to see the right kinds of activities happening in the right kinds of places. So I think that's part of the picture here is trying to use the land most appropriately. And so discussions about land sparing and sharing and ensuring that activities happen in the right places with the right level of incentive to innovate both socially and technically, I think is where we're going with that kind of discourse at the moment. I don't think it's actually as easy as it sounds, just to put things in the right place and have the right kind of land doing the right kinds of things in terms of production is not that straightforward. And then obviously there are people on the ground who own the land, farm the land and so on, and may well want to do different things, and that would be entirely in their purview as the land managers there. So I think over time, though, the sort of direction we're trying to set is to have areas that are highly productive to become very sustainable in doing that, and areas that are potentially less productive, they might want to look at how they can generate income from the land by potentially looking at land use changes or marginal land use changes that might move them towards more regenerative approaches.
Yeah, great. There is a little bit of a challenge though, isn't there, about multi-use of land. And so planting lots of trees is not necessarily food production. So
yeah, I think it's really easy to use the jargon of multifunctional land use. It's really easy to talk about trade-offs. It's much harder to be explicit about them, to agree them, and for that to be done at quite a devolved level spatially. I think that's the real challenge.
Yeah, very, very difficult, very challenging indeed. So now we've got a question from Ida Kubiziski, who's on the panel. So Ida, please, would you like to ask your question in person?
Thanks, Henrietta. Thanks for a great talk. That was really cool. Really impressive work you guys are doing. Has there been any conversations in the UK through your group about setting up some kind of payment for ecosystem services scheme, whether it's some kind of public-private partnership or anything like that, because that would seem to sort of enable you to do this work even further.
So the answer is yes. And then there are, lots of slightly different work streams underneath that. So in principle, absolutely yes. We're also quite keen to have a blended finance approach. So that's money coming from both government, private sources, possibly even other public sources, and possibly even second sector as well, water companies, whatever it might be. So yeah, we'd be quite keen to see some marketization of some of the outcomes that we'd be trying to drive here. Ultimately, that would help secure longer term funding, longer term supports, and the environmental outcomes that are generated from that. So all of the schemes are intended to to potentially attract blended finance, and it's certainly a key part of landscape recovery. As I say, how the blend works is very difficult. So there's lots of work going on, for example, about payment by results. It's a different way of trying to look at how you create markets here. And then obviously offsets and so on have their complications as well around accounting the veracity of the market, and some of the economics in that is beyond me, but a hugely important part of the picture. I think the other thing that's slightly challenging is there's a lot of focus on carbon, but there are potentially lots of other things that might suffer perverse consequences if we sort of narrow ourselves down too much to those things that are most attractive to finance, or at least initially most attractive because they've had the most amount of airtime.
Great, thank you.
So we've got a question from Chris Harker, and he's asking, when you talk about the sector, this isn't presumably a coherent entity. So there are commercial farmers who dominate, but presumably there are other a group of much smaller organic farmers. And so how can you ensure that different voices are heard in your engagement?
Yeah, good question. So when we talk about the sector, that's quite loose actually. We're talking about practitioners, owners, tenants, smallholders, not just the bigger players at all. We're also talking about the environmental sector, so environmental NGOs that are already doing interesting things on their land, whether that's very low level grazing and trying to restore wetlands and meadows and even agroforestry and all kinds of things like that. So the sector is quite a broad term, and we have all kinds of activity that goes on in terms of engagement to try and encourage a very plural number of voices to come forward. We have an ELM engagement group, for example, which is sat on by farmers, tenant groups, as well as environmental NGOs and others. So we're pretty open door about ensuring that everyone gets a decent say. And then for all of our projects, particularly under landscape recovery, consultation locally and participation locally is absolutely essential to how we see those projects thriving.
Yeah. And we also have a question from Ying, who's also on the panel, and she can ask her question in person too. Ying, are you there?
So, thank you very much for your amazing speech. I'm a PhD student at IGP, and I'm also a teaching assistant for the master students, because today we have a lot of master students in the audience. And in the class, we discuss a lot about the community-based solutions or approach to solve the challenges. But the students, they always ask us about the scale up of the solutions. So I just wanted to forward this question to you and hope that you can provide some like answers to this kind of question. It's what we can scale up for these locally based or like community-based solutions, or should we scale up the solutions? Thank you very much.
Yeah, questions of scale, always very challenging.
Yeah, so as a geographer in a previous life, this is very, very welcome. Scale is very complex, as you know. Our schemes are designed to work across different scalar tensions. So, for example, local nature recovery, the second scheme, if you will, out of the three that I mentioned at the beginning, that's designed to have farmers collaborating across all kinds of patches and networks of land, potentially sort of county-wide. So the sort of benefits of that collaborative advantage would be felt at quite a large scale, whereas landscape recovery projects are very site-specific. That's why we have this notion of contiguity or continuous land parcel within the project scope. We try and accommodate, there are variations in what local means and what community-led means across the country. So, the Southwest, where I'm based in North Devon, is quite different from parts of Northumbria and so on scale, on the sort of even sort of size of population in terms of who might participate, what level of activity there might be. So I think we have to try and be responsive to what people want to do, where the appetite is. But I think we also, particularly for government, we have quite a strong convening role. It's quite important for us to facilitate and enable community-derived solutions. So in terms of scaling up, local nature recovery is where we would hope that, we'd see the most endogenous or bottom-up scaling up approach, if you like, supported by funding from us, but also incentivizing people to do things because you get both an environmental outcome from it, but also it's more efficient. It should be more cost effective. So hopefully, the logic of that sells itself. But I think scaling is hugely challenging. 70-ish% of the UK's landscape is in farmland. So we're hugely reliant on the sector to come up with these solutions, to want to participate. We can provide incentives, we can offer funding and so on, but there's absolutely no guarantee of participation. So the great strength of any long-term change is going to be coming from community-led, shared and participatory practices, if in my opinion at least. So we can try and incentivize participation, we can try and incentivize scale, but we can't generate it. We can only steer, fund and guide. Ultimately, you'll see different practices in different parts of the country. So I'm afraid I don't really have an answer as to whether you can scale up or scale down. All we can do is provide the scaffold from which people could look to generate that scale.
Yes, it's obviously a very challenging situation, but I was just wondering whether you and your team have been taking any inspiration from other sort of emerging land management schemes around the world, or whether is there anyone that you're looking to outside the UK who's done something that you think is interesting or innovative or provides a way forward?
Yeah, so I mean, we look to anywhere where there's good practice, basically, and there are a number of great examples. I think in terms of defining eligibility in terms of participation of local communities and so on, we have been looking at North America a fair bit, as well as New Zealand. The specificity, for example, of some of the initiatives, particularly around forestry and so on, and land use change, land tenure, land ownership, have been, particularly captivating from there. Done very well, at least the governance arrangements. I wouldn't want to talk about participation rates or practice and so on. In terms of agricultural practices, obviously New Zealand got rid of its subsidies a number of years ago.
Yep.
So that's a key area that we're obviously interested in trying to understand how that transition has worked, you know, and look at questions of scale and so on, and speak to our colleagues in other parts of the world. We also work closely with the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to quite commonly look at good and best practice from wherever it may be across different countries, not just their members, but also beyond. And that's probably the primary source of how we look at the comparative analysis of where we sit relative to other players globally, and also just trying to spot good practice. That's key. If someone's doing it really well somewhere else, we're very happy to try and borrow those ideas.
Yeah. Let's go back to Bob, who has another question. Bob.
Thanks, Henrietta. So just to follow up on that, it seems like a lot of what you're trying to do is you need to look at the watershed scale, especially when you're talking about water quality, but also the integration across different elements in the landscape. And there's certainly been a lot of research and activity both on the science side, but also on the management side of how to manage these complex watersheds and how to integrate in the governance of the watershed, all of the different stakeholders, private and public partners. So is that something of particular interest, to look at the watershed scale in particular, as a way to scale up some of the things you're doing, and not just random pieces of the landscape, but focus on watersheds, given that unifying element of the water flowing through those landscapes and the influence that it has on how these landscapes function.
Yes, one of our agencies, the Environment Agency, they have a thing called catchment sensitive farming. And they have catchment groups. They have a lot of engagement along the catchment. They have a lot of participation from all sectors, and it certainly has lessons for us in what's important in terms of scale. Certainly, yeah. So yeah, very much in agreement, Bob.
It's a difficult one though, because you have, there's one of the most interesting examples of this concerns a place in Kenya called the Tana River. And here, the Kenyans have been working for some time to think about how to create, upward and downward benefits, and how to create new value and new kinds of products, by managing what would be the emergence of a new market. So the Tana River has many, many things going on, but anyway, one of the things it does is it's involved in the catchment areas that deliver water into Nairobi, and also water that deliver water into other parts of the country where there's a lot of tourism. And so the connection here is to try and understand how you pay farmers who are in the key areas who have to do the restoration of the water catchment area to do the things you want them to do for the regeneration of the land, but connect that to the ability to supply clean water for tourists who really, really hate being unwell when they come on their holidays, right? So essentially it's a very much more sophisticated system, and we can send you a link to it, but essentially that's how that works. And so you end up with exactly the kind of market you might be looking at for the UK, where the tourism industry is actually paying for part of the work that needs to be done, and it's paying the people who are actually doing the work to do it. And there are other people who are involved upstream and downstream. So there might be some very good, I think there might be some really very interesting examples from the global south, I think, in this area. We can probably think of a few more. but the catchment groups are doing something slightly different, aren't they? They're not really working on the management of markets, are they? They're still working on the management of the area, aren't they?
That's right. And I mean, there are various explorations into how this might work for markets. I think there's some work going on in the Solent, for example, that's looking at nutrients markets and so on. I mean, I don't have the detail with me, but there are some interesting things happening there. I certainly would be very happy to gather as many good examples from the global south as well. We're also aware of things that don't work. We're quite keen to pick those up. There are some examples from various European countries. I want to name and shame them, but there were a couple of projects where poor governance regimes locally, and there was a bit of an exclusion of potential local participants in various projects, and obviously that had quite a bad outcome in the end.
Yeah.
Bit of a backlash from the locals. So things like that have been quite instructive in helping us particularly advise our ministers on how to make this as collaborative, open, transparent, and plural as possible.
Yeah, yeah. Bob, you wanted to come back. Sorry, I probably came in too quickly with my comment there. Sorry.
No, just quickly. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with the work of Elinor Ostrom and about common asset management, which a lot of which comes from studying indigenous cultures and how they manage watersheds sustainably and well, and these issues about how to manage upstream, downstream trade-offs and conflicts, and the kinds of governance rules really that she has come up with that create sort of the core necessary conditions to have a sustainable land management. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to incorporate in these ideas of common asset trusts, to sort of learn from what has worked for managing these assets traditionally, and how can we put those into a modern context so that you can handle these whole systems, more sustainably, and use economic incentives in the appropriate way, and have a governance framework that does actually engage all of the stakeholders, in developing the rules and enforcing the rules. And there's a whole series of, there's a large literature on sort of how this might be done. But that might be really interesting to incorporate into the kinds of things you're thinking about. Thanks.
Do you want to come back there, Kieron? Or
I was just going to say absolutely.
Well, we can carry on having different conversations about it. But the thing about the rivers is very, very interesting, because it's one of those areas, I think, where we see how very challenging your job is, because one of the stage 2 of the work that you're involved with will be about restoring water quality in rivers and water habitat and so on. And yet there's just been an announcement, as I understand it, because of the current fiscal constraint that we're under, that we won't be doing anything about the current problem we've been having with our rivers, which is that only 14% of them actually meet the standard that we have set. Now, I'm sure you're closer to that decision than I am, and I wouldn't wish you to say anything you don't want to say, but it seems to me that there are pushes and pulls within government policy that are pretty hard to manage when you're dealing with the science part of it. Must be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't want to get myself into trouble.
No.
But there's definitely a distinction between evidence-based policy making and policy-based evidence making. So yeah, my profession is trying to ensure it's evidence-based policy making rather than the other way around.
Yes, I can see that, and because you might have heard me speak on a few occasions about the fact that I'm rather concerned about rivers, so I keep raising this issue. But it's a very challenging. I think often, especially for the students who are on the call, they don't really realize how very challenging it is to drive change in this way through innovative government policy. It isn't actually at all easy. And the science is part of it, but the people are part of it. And then, of course, there's the politics and all the rest of it that goes alongside it, which is pretty difficult. But going back to the science, which might be a more comfortable spot to be in, I'm wondering about how much of the information that this fabulous program that you're involved in is going to generate a lot of information. So how much of that, when it is generated, what's the department's thinking about all that data being open source in some way for all of us to access?
Yeah, that's very much the aspiration. We need to ensure that we're compliant with GDPR and that we have the consent of the various projects and so on and their proposals. There are obviously some questions about whether that data should be publicly available during the development phase, or whether that's seen as a difficult point in time to share that information, or whether practitioners and recipients of funding would be cautious about that. So, our best endeavors are to ensure that as I said, when I was speaking, that we can make data as open and accessible and hopefully integratable with other data sets and so on as possible. I think the more of us that do that, the more of us that help do that, the fuller picture we'll have, the richer picture, and obviously that would be much more valuable for research and other purposes. Yeah,
and I think it's also about speeding up the social innovation that you talked about, because the knowledge sharing that those kind of open data platforms can enable, if they are very well designed, is quite substantial. Even if you're just looking at it within the sector, because you've just described doing things across the landscape in different areas where people put forward their proposals. But of course, if the outcomes of those are available, then other people looking at them can say, well, there's somebody I need to get in touch with to find out whether I can, I don't know, restore the area of peat I've got, or plant the trees, or what's the metric on carbon sequestration, and the relationship between carbon sequestration in the tree and carbon sequestration in the soil, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these very difficult challenges. So there's huge potential there, I think, for data to create all sorts of new forms of value for us in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly with some of our assumptions and practices. So, planting trees can actually have, potentially perverse environmental outcomes. So I think the idea that one is seen as good and one bad is something we need to be a bit mindful of. So, for example, planting trees in peatland would be a horrendous thing to do in terms of carbon sequestration. So,
yeah.
But that kind of information can only be out there, once we've got that data shared and open and so on. So I think I'm all in favor of being as open as possible. It's quite hard from where I sit to make that happen always. So we do need a bit of a push from you guys as well to actually ensure that happens. That always helps. But yeah, I think in principle, we're very keen to do it. It's just how we get there in practice.
How we get there in practice. Indeed, indeed. Well, look, thank you so much, Kieron. I mean, sadly, we're out of time, as we often are in the IGP when we're having good fun with things. I keep running out of time, but thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for joining us. And we hope that you will be coming and chatting to us again, because we've got lots of people who would like to make a contribution. So, we're going to give you a virtual round of applause beyond the panel. So, thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for nice discussion. It's always nice to get out to the real world and talk to people about what's happening. And all of your questions were, hugely challenging actually. So I hope I did them at least some justice.
You did.
If we weren't recorded, I might give you a different response to some of them. But ultimately, I think I was.
Perhaps a visit to the IGP office would be a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, and very happy to come along and discuss this work, or your work indeed, at any point in time as well. That'd be great.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kieron. Okay, I hope your afternoon improves. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.